The year is 1947. The city of Los Angeles stands fresh off the cusp of World War II. While the city was nowhere near as big as it is today, in the standards of the 1940s, things were beginning to take off. The population was seeing a drastic rise as people flooded into town from all over the world. It seemed as if the new future of the city was right around the corner. But on the early morning of January 15th, a shocking discovery of a mutilated woman would put the entire city on edge for months and create one of the largest unsolved mysteries of all time. This is the tragic murder and investigation of Elizabeth Short, or Black Dahlia. Before I begin, this video contains topics of death and violence, so viewer discretion is advised. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters to Cleo Alvin Short Jr. and Phoebe May Sawyer. Her father Cleo was a U.S. Navy sailor, and Phoebe was a housewife. Unfortunately for the family, their early life was nothing but chaotic. Cleo had lost the majority of his money during the 1929 stock market crash, and as a result, his lifelong mini-golf company collapsed shortly after. Furthermore, a year after this, after Cleo had not come home that night after work, police were sent to look for him. To the family's shock, Cleo's car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge, and it was assumed that he had jumped due to his financial ruin. To support the family, Short's mother Phoebe worked long hours as a bookkeeper. Elizabeth Short's life would become even more stressful when she turned 15. After years of dealing with bronchitis and asthma, Short underwent lung surgery, and doctors recommended she move to a milder climate without the threat of cold winters. As a result, Short's mother had her spend the winters in Miami, Florida with her grandparents. Between the lung issues, loss of a father, and yearly relocation, Elizabeth Short decided to drop out of high school during her sophomore year. It's not too clear as to what Elizabeth did during these years after dropping out of high school, but in 1942, something would change the course of her life. To the entire family's surprise, Elizabeth's mother would receive a letter in late 1942 from Cleo. The letter was an apology addressing the fact that he had faked his death and explained that he was very much alive and living in Vallejo, California. Despite the nature of his disappearance, this was great news to Elizabeth, who had missed him dearly, and with little keeping her out east, she decided to move to Vallejo to be with him. This would unfortunately not last long for the two, as according to sources, they argued quite often. It's not 100% clear as to why these arguments sparked, but it was likely due to a lack of trust between Elizabeth and her father. So in January of 1943, Elizabeth moved out of her father's home to live by herself in California. Things continued to spiral out of control for Elizabeth after this. For a while, she lived with a U.S. Air Force sergeant, whom she was romantically involved with. But after several physical altercations, where he became violent towards her, she left. In the middle of 1943, she moved out to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested for underage drinking. As a result, she was sent back to Massachusetts by authorities. But at this point, Elizabeth decided to relocate back to Florida, and it's here where she met Major Matthew Gordon Jr. of the 2nd Air Commando Group. The two hit it off immediately, but sadly he was quickly deployed to the Pacific to fight in World War II. During this time, Elizabeth told family and friends that he had sent a letter promising to propose to her, but tragically this would never occur, as he was killed in a plane crash on August 10th, 1945. Feeling quite lost at this point for obvious reasons, Elizabeth decided to move back to California and live in Los Angeles, where she spent time as a waitress, and reportedly an aspiring actress, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence of her taking part in films. It was after a visit to San Diego to meet with her new boyfriend, Robert Manley, that tragedy and horror would strike. On January 9th, 1947, Manley would drop Elizabeth off at the Biltmore Hotel, and that would be the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth alive. Elizabeth's sister would arrive that evening to meet with her, but after she didn't arrive at their meeting point, panic began to set in. 6 days later, on January 16th, authorities would find a horrific discovery. In a vacant lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue, Elizabeth's body would be found by police. Horrifically, her body was surgically cut into 2 pieces, and she was completely drained of blood, leaving her skin pale and white. Her mouth was cut on the ends, creating an effect known as the Glasgow smile, where the cuts make it seem as if the person is smiling. Several spots on her body had large pieces of flesh removed, and it seemed to authorities that her body had been washed with gasoline and posed for people to find, with her hands on her head and her elbows bent at right angles. During the autopsy, police found ligature marks, or essentially pressure marks, typically found on strangulation or bondage victims. They found these marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck. Police were also baffled by the fact that her body had been cut in half with such surgical precision. According to sources, this type of technique was known as hemicorporectomy. This type of amputation was implemented right below the waist and was typically only utilized by doctors as a last resort for those who were in desperate need. Obviously, in this case, the offender was not attempting to keep her alive, but the interesting part lies in the killer's ability to perform the complex surgical procedure. Prior to announcing the death of her daughter, authorities called Elizabeth's mother and stated that her daughter had won a beauty contest out west. From doing this, they were able to gather as much information about Elizabeth as they needed, and only then did they tell her that Elizabeth had actually been murdered. I typically don't share my opinions about cases within this channel, but I can't help but mention how incredibly messed up this decision was. On January 21st, 1947, James Richardson, editor of The Examiner, would receive an anonymous phone call from an individual claiming to be Elizabeth's killer. The killer congratulated James Richardson for his coverage of the case in the newspaper, and told him that he would eventually turn himself in, but not before playing with the cops a bit longer. He also said, quote, "Expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail." And 3 days later, on January 24th, the killer would do just that. A manila envelope addressed to, quote, "The Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers" would arrive. On the cover, with the letters cut from a magazine, read, "Here's Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Dahlia being a nickname for Elizabeth, which I'll explain later. Within the envelope was Elizabeth's birth certificate, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen on the cover. Like Elizabeth's body before, this envelope had been properly cleaned with gasoline, but this time police were able to lift partial fingerprints from the envelope. But this would unfortunately never come to fruition, as the fingerprints were damaged during transport to the FBI, and were therefore unable to be utilized. That same day, a handbag and black suede shoes would mysteriously arrive on a garbage can 2 miles from the crime scene. These would also be cleaned with gasoline. Then on March 14th, police would make another discovery. Found tucked away in a shoe in a pile of clothes near the ocean at Venice, Los Angeles, was a note. The note read, quote, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that, or this. Sorry, Mary," end quote. Whether or not this note was from the killer remains unknown to this very day. Police were quick to identify Mark Hansen, the name upon the cover of the address book, as a possible suspect. During the investigation, police had found that Elizabeth had recently rejected Hansen's advances towards her. However, despite this, police cleared his name from the suspect list after further investigation. It seems a little counterintuitive that the killer would put his name on the front of an address book and also relay to investigators that he or she wanted a game of cat and mouse with them. Over 150 men were interviewed in the ensuing weeks, but to no avail. A reward of $10,000, or roughly $130,000 in today's money, was posted in reward for information leading to the arrest of Short's killer. Unsurprisingly, like many other crime cases, after this, several false confessions were made, but nothing led to an actual arrest. After this, a volley of unverified reporting and supposed letters would flood the office of media companies around LA, most of which were likely just an attempt to gain more publicity regarding the investigation of murders. By 1947, the case had shifted into a cold case, and Sergeant Finis Brown of the LAPD and a head investigator of the case would state on record that this was due to the fact that the press had a massive amount of unverified reporting and involvement in the sensitive investigation, and others would blame it on police for sloppy investigating. So why is it called the Black Dahlia murders? Well, there seems to be several rumors as to how this name came into fruition, but this is the most credible one in my opinion. Supposedly, during the investigation, an employee for the Herald Express news company interviewed an acquaintance of Elizabeth's that worked at a local drugstore. This was reportedly the nickname they called her, and ever since then, the name stuck with the press and was used for a majority of papers surrounding the investigation. The name is a reference to The Blue Dahlia, an American crime noir that released in 1946, a year before the murder. So what happened to this case? Have any strides been made to solve it? Elizabeth Short would be buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. Elizabeth's mother would move out to Oakland to be closer with her shortly after the case went cold. One of the only bright sides I can see to this case was the fact that the murder inspired members of the state assembly to pass a bill that would essentially create a sex offender registry, with California becoming the first state to require sex offenders to be registered. Over the years, several individuals would tip investigators off, but all of them would fall flat without much evidence to back them up. There's been possible links to other murders throughout the years, but I'm not going to cover them here, as there just isn't enough evidence to prove a connection, and there are far too many possible killers to cover thoroughly in this video. The Black Dahlia murder remains one of the most horrific and puzzling crimes within the United States and possibly the world. How did someone manage to disfigure the body with such surgical precision and malice? How was the killer able to contact police over and over again, toying with them each time, and presumably getting away with it all? These are questions that I unfortunately do not think will ever be answered, as the case is reaching nearly 80 years old and everyone involved has likely died at this point. As it stands now, the Black Dahlia murder remains a horrible loss of life on an individual who died far too soon. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other content. I cover all sorts of unsolved mysteries and true crime cases. Have a great day. Goodbye.